Beneath St. Sebastian's church, a creature lived that didn't just punish. It devoured human rage, hunger gnawing at souls until the freed slaves of Ashford County became hollow, silent, and incapable of anger or rebellion, even as their lives mirrored slavery. A missionary who dared to uncover it realized the horror wasn't in what it did to bodies, but in what it stole from minds, feeding invisibly while the white congregation offered it willingly, piece by piece, year after year. Before I discover the whole truth, subscribe to my channel Untold Fear and comment your location below, because what you're about to witness isn't just evil. It's something that survived on humanity itself, and it should never have existed. Reverend Thomas Garrett arrived in Ashford County on a cold December morning in 1868, sent by the Northern Methodist Episcopal Church to assess conditions for freed slaves in rural Georgia. At 32 years old, Thomas was considered young for such a mission, but his dedication to racial equality and his experience working with freedmen's schools in Virginia made him the ideal candidate for this difficult assignment. The war had been over for 3 years, but the South remained a landscape of barely suppressed violence and resentment. Reconstruction was official policy, but in practice, many freed slaves found themselves in conditions that differed from slavery only in technical legal terms. Thomas had seen sharecropping arrangements that trapped entire families in debt they could never repay, labor contracts that functioned as slavery by another name, and violence against black citizens that went unpunished by local authorities. But Ashford County was different. According to reports, the transition had been remarkably peaceful. There were no accounts of Klan violence, no complaints filed with the Freedmen's Bureau, no incidents of racial conflict that plagued neighboring counties. The local Methodist church, St. Sebastian's, even held integrated services, whites on Sunday morning, blacks on Sunday evening, sharing the same sacred space in apparent harmony. It seemed too good to be true. Thomas's superiors suspected the reports were falsified, that someone was covering up violence and oppression. His mission was to discover the truth and report back to the church leadership in Philadelphia. The town of Ashford was built around a central square dominated by St. Sebastian's Church. The building was old, predating the war by at least 30 years, constructed of local fieldstone with a tall spire that could be seen for miles across the flat Georgia farmland. The architecture was simple but solid, built to last generations. Thomas arrived on a Wednesday, securing lodging at a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Clara Henderson. She was a thin, nervous woman in her 50s who seemed startled by his presence. "We don't get many visitors from the north," she said, showing him to a small but clean room on the second floor. "Especially not ministers. Is there trouble with the church?" "No trouble," Thomas assured her. "I'm here to observe and report on how Reconstruction is progressing. Your county has been noted as an example of peaceful transition. My superiors want to understand how you've achieved what so many others haven't." Mrs. Henderson's expression was difficult to read. "We're blessed, I suppose. Reverend Pritchard says we've found the path to peace. That's what he calls it, the path. I look forward to meeting Reverend Pritchard. Oh, he'll want to meet you too. He's very proud of what we've accomplished here." She paused at the doorway. "You'll attend services on Sunday, I imagine?" "Both services, yes. Morning and evening." Something flickered across her face. Concern, perhaps, or warning. "Both services. Of course. Well, you'll certainly see something remarkable." She left before Thomas could ask what she meant. That afternoon, Thomas walked through Ashford, observing and making mental notes. The town was small, perhaps 800 residents total, split roughly between white and black. The white population seemed prosperous enough, with well-maintained homes and thriving businesses around the central square. The black population lived primarily in an area called Liberty Quarter, a collection of small cabins and houses southeast of town. Thomas walked through the area, noting conditions that were poor, but not exceptionally so compared to other rural black communities he'd visited. Children played in dusty yards, women hung laundry, men returned from working in the fields. But something felt wrong. It took Thomas nearly an hour to identify what was bothering him. Everyone was too calm, too placid, too content. In every other black community Thomas had visited across the South, there was an undercurrent of tension, of suppressed anger, of grief barely contained. People spoke in hushed tones about injustices, about family members still missing, about the daily humiliations and dangers of life in the defeated Confederacy. Even in communities where open protest was impossible, that anger simmered beneath the surface, visible in tight jaws and hard eyes and voices that carried bitterness when they thought no white observers were listening. Liberty Quarter had none of that. People greeted him politely, answered his questions with calm, measured responses, and showed no signs of the trauma that should have been universal among people who had recently been enslaved. Thomas stopped a woman in her 40s who was sweeping her front porch. She introduced herself as Dinah Carlisle, mother of 4, wife of a field worker named Moses. "How are you finding freedom?" Thomas asked carefully. "Is it what you hoped?" Dinah smiled, a genuine smile, unforced. "We're blessed, Reverend. The Lord has been good to us. We have work, homes, our families are together. What more could we ask? And your treatment? By the white community. They've been fair. Reverend Pritchard teaches that we're all God's children. We worship in the same church now, different times, but the same holy place. It's a miracle, truly." Thomas wanted to press harder, to dig beneath the pleasant surface, but something stopped him. Dinah's contentment seemed genuine, not performed. She spoke without the careful selection of words that characterized people who were afraid of being overheard or reported. She seemed to actually believe what she was saying. "Tell me about the church services," Thomas said. "The evening service, specifically. What's it like?" For the first time, Dinah's expression changed slightly. Not fear, not exactly, but something else. "It's peaceful, very peaceful. Reverend Pritchard preaches about forgiveness, about letting go of anger and bitterness, about finding peace in Christ's love." "And do you?" "Find peace." "Yes." The word came quickly, firmly. "Every Sunday evening, we find peace." The way she emphasized those last 2 words sent a chill down Thomas's spine, though he couldn't articulate why. That evening, Thomas met Reverend William Pritchard at St. Sebastian's Church. Pritchard was a tall man in his 60s, with silver hair and a commanding presence. He greeted Thomas warmly, showing him through the church with obvious pride. "I'm so pleased the Northern Church has taken interest in our work here," Pritchard said, his Georgia accent thick, but his vocabulary educated. "We've accomplished something truly remarkable, a model for how the races can coexist peacefully in the New South." The church interior was simple but beautiful. Wooden pews, plain glass windows, a raised pulpit. Everything was meticulously maintained. But as they walked, Thomas noticed something odd about the layout. "Is there a basement?" he asked, noting a door behind the pulpit that seemed to lead downward. Pritchard's smile didn't waver, but something shifted in his eyes. "Yes, we have storage space below. Root cellars, mostly." The church was built over a natural depression in the land, quite deep, actually. The original builders used it for practical purposes. "May I see it?" "It's just storage, I'm afraid. Nothing of interest. And the stairs are quite steep. Dangerous, really. We keep it locked to prevent accidents." Pritchard gestured toward the sanctuary. "But please sit. Tell me about your mission here. What questions can I answer?" They talked for an hour. Pritchard explained his theology of reconciliation, his belief that Christian love could overcome racial division, his methods of teaching both white and black congregations to see each other as brothers and sisters in Christ. It all sounded reasonable, even admirable. But Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental was being left unsaid. "I'd like to attend both services on Sunday," Thomas said, "to observe how this integration works in practice." "Of course. You're most welcome at both." Pritchard stood, preparing to conclude their meeting. "Though I should mention, the evening service is quite different from the morning. Different energy, different focus. You may find it surprising." "Different how?" Pritchard seemed to choose his words carefully. "The morning service focuses on gratitude and order, helping our white congregation accept the new social reality. The evening service focuses on peace and forgiveness, helping our colored congregation release anger and bitterness. Both are necessary for true reconciliation. And it works? They actually release their anger." "Oh yes." Pritchard's smile was serene. "Every single Sunday, they find perfect peace. It's quite miraculous, really. I couldn't accomplish it through preaching alone, of course. The church itself seems to facilitate the process. This is holy ground, Reverend Garrett. Truly holy." After leaving the church, Thomas walked back toward his boarding house as dusk settled over Ashford. He passed several black families heading home from their work, and he stopped a man in his 30s carrying tools from a carpentry shop. "Excuse me, I'm Reverend Garrett. I'm visiting from Philadelphia." Might I ask you a few questions? The man stopped, his expression polite but neutral. I'm Isaac Freeman, Reverend. What do you need to know? I'm trying to understand how this community has achieved such peaceful coexistence. How would you describe your treatment here? Honestly, Isaac set down his tools. Honestly, it's better than I expected. We work hard, but we're paid. Not much, but something. We're not beaten. Our families are together. We can worship freely. Before Sunday evenings, I used to feel angry all the time. Angry about the past, about what was done to us, to my parents, my sister who was sold away when I was a boy. That anger was like a fire inside me, burning constantly. And now I have peace. Every Sunday evening, in that church, the anger just goes away. Like someone lifting a weight off my shoulders. I know I should still be angry. Probably I have the right to be angry. But I'm not. I'm peaceful. And life is easier that way. Thomas felt that chill again. Does the anger ever come back? Sometimes. During the week, if something happens, disrespect, injustice, reminders of the old days. But it never gets too strong before Sunday evening comes again. And then, Isaac smiled slightly. Then we go to church, and it all just flows away. Reverend Pritchard says we're learning to forgive. That forgiveness is the path to peace. Is that what it feels like? Forgiveness. Isaac's smile faded. He looked at Thomas with eyes that held something Thomas couldn't quite identify. Not fear, not sadness, but something hollow. I don't know what forgiveness feels like, Reverend. This feels like emptiness. But emptiness is better than burning. He picked up his tools and continued walking, leaving Thomas standing alone in the gathering darkness. That night, Thomas lay awake in his boarding house room, troubled by everything he'd observed. The Black community's complete lack of anger or bitterness wasn't natural. It was impossible, given what they'd endured. Slavery hadn't ended 3 years ago. Many of these people had spent their entire lives in bondage, had watched family members sold, had experienced horrors that should have left permanent psychological scars. Yet they claimed to have found peace. Perfect, complete peace. Sunday morning came with clear skies and cold wind. Thomas dressed carefully and walked to St. Sebastian's church, arriving early to observe the white congregation gathering. They came in family groups, dressed in their best clothes, greeting each other with the practiced civility of small-town Southern society. Thomas counted approximately 75 people, nearly the entire white population of Ashford. They filed into the church, filling the pews with quiet murmurs of conversation. Reverend Pritchard's morning sermon focused on gratitude and divine order. He spoke about accepting God's will, about understanding that the war's outcome was part of a larger divine plan, about learning to live in harmony with former slaves who were now neighbors and fellow Christians. The sermon was skillfully crafted, acknowledging white resentment while gently redirecting it toward acceptance. The congregation listened attentively. They sang hymns with genuine feeling. They prayed with apparent sincerity. And when the service ended, they filed out looking peaceful. Not happy, exactly, but calm. Accepting. As if the rage and resentment that should have characterized defeated Confederates had been smoothed away. Thomas stayed as the white congregation departed, watching Reverend Pritchard prepare for the evening service. The Reverend changed nothing about the sanctuary. Same in books, same candles, same arrangement. But as the afternoon wore on and the time for evening service approached, Thomas noticed the temperature dropping despite the fact that the church was heated by a potbelly stove that had been burning all day. By 6 o'clock, when the Black congregation began arriving, the church felt noticeably colder than it had that morning. Thomas mentioned this to Reverend Pritchard, who was greeting arrivals at the door. The basement, Pritchard explained casually. Air flows up through gaps in the floorboards. Creates a chill in the evenings. We've tried to seal it, but the old building has its quirks. The Black congregation numbered about 60 people, men, women, and children, dressed in their Sunday clothes, which were noticeably simpler and more worn than what the white congregation had worn that morning. They entered quietly, filing into the pews with an orderly precision that seemed almost choreographed. Thomas sat in the back, observing. He noticed that several people glanced at the floor during the service, as if hearing something beneath them. He noticed that children seemed unusually subdued, sitting perfectly still even when the service ran long. He noticed that everyone, from the oldest to the youngest, seemed to be waiting for something. The service began normally enough. Hymns were sung, different hymns from the morning service, spirituals that spoke of suffering and deliverance. Prayers were offered, and then Reverend Pritchard began his sermon. "My brothers and sisters," he said, his voice taking on a different quality than it had that morning. Deeper, more resonant, almost hypnotic. "You have carried burdens that no human being should bear. You have suffered injustices that cry out to heaven. You have every right to anger, to rage, to bitterness that burns in your hearts like fire." The congregation murmured agreement. Thomas saw tension in their faces, remembered grief surfacing. "But anger is poison," Pritchard continued. "It destroys the one who carries it more than it harms those who deserve it. Bitterness is a chain heavier than any your former masters placed on you. Tonight, as we do every Sunday, we will give those burdens to the Lord. We will release them into His hands. We will find peace." And then Pritchard did something Thomas had never seen in any church service. He moved to the door behind the pulpit, the door leading to the basement, and opened it. The temperature dropped immediately, noticeably. Cold air flowed up from below, carrying with it a smell that Thomas couldn't identify. Not decay, not exactly, but something organic and ancient, like stones that had never seen sunlight. "Let us pray," Pritchard said. But he didn't bow his head. Instead, he stood beside the open doorway, hands raised, and began speaking in a language Thomas didn't recognize. Not Latin, not Greek, not any European tongue he'd studied. The words seemed to come from somewhere much older, much darker. The congregation bowed their heads and began to pray silently. And as they prayed, Thomas saw something that made his blood freeze. A darkness began flowing up from the basement. Not smoke, not shadow, but something else, something that moved with purpose and intelligence. It flowed across the floor like liquid, then rose in tendrils that reached toward the praying congregation. Thomas started to stand, to shout a warning, but found himself paralyzed, not physically held, but unable to move, as if his will had been suspended. The darkness touched the first person, a woman in her 50s sitting in the front pew, and she gasped. Her body tensed, her hands gripped the pew in front of her, and Thomas saw her face contort with emotion. Rage, grief, hatred, all surfacing at once, pulling from some deep place where they'd been locked away. And then the darkness drew it out of her. Thomas watched, horrified, fascinated, as something invisible but tangible was extracted from the woman's body. Her face relaxed. Her hands released the pew. She slumped forward slightly, then sat back up with an expression of perfect, empty peace. The darkness moved to the next person, and the process repeated. Person by person, row by row, the darkness touched each member of the congregation and drew out their anger, their grief, their righteous fury at everything they'd endured. And with each extraction, the people became calmer, emptier, more peaceful. Thomas finally managed to move. He stumbled backward, hitting the wall behind him. The sound made Reverend Pritchard turn, and for the first time, Thomas saw the Reverend's true expression, not benevolent, not peaceful, but satisfied. The look of someone witnessing exactly what he'd intended. "Don't be afraid, Reverend Garrett." Pritchard called over the sound of the congregation's gasping and crying as their pain was extracted. "You're witnessing a miracle. These people are being freed from burdens that would destroy them." "What is that thing?" Thomas managed to choke out. "A gift from God. Or perhaps something older. I'm not entirely certain, and I've long since stopped questioning." Pritchard watched the darkness work with the fascination of a scientist observing an experiment. The church was built over it deliberately. The original builders knew it was here. The Creek and Cherokee people told stories about this place. Something that lived deep in the earth, something that fed on strong emotions. The whites who built Ashford were smart enough to recognize its potential. Thomas watched as the darkness reached the back rows, touching children now. Seeing it extract pain from children. Children who should have been allowed to grieve, to rage, to process trauma naturally, made him sick. "You're using it," Thomas whispered. "Using it to control them." "I'm using it to bring peace," Pritchard corrected. "Do you understand how dangerous angry freed slaves are to white Southerners? How much violence we've avoided here because these people have no rage left to fuel rebellion? This isn't cruelty, Reverend Garrett. This is mercy for everyone, for them and for us. This is theft." Thomas found his voice growing stronger. "You're stealing their right to feel, to grieve, to be angry at the injustices they've suffered. I'm preventing those feelings from destroying them and everyone around them, Pritchard countered. Tell me honestly, would you prefer they burn with rage? That they strike out violently and be killed for it? That they pass that anger to their children and grandchildren, creating generations of bitter, damaged souls? Or would you prefer they find peace, even if the mechanism is unusual? Thomas had no answer. Because part of him, the part that had seen racial violence, that had witnessed lynchings and massacres, understood the terrible logic. The darkness finished its work and flowed back down into the basement like water circling a drain. Pritchard closed the door, and the temperature began to rise again. The congregation sat in perfect stillness, faces blank, bodies relaxed. "Let us sing," Pritchard said, and they sang. Their voices were beautiful, harmonious, completely without emotion. After the service, the congregation filed out with the same orderly precision they'd entered with. They smiled at Thomas, empty smiles that didn't reach their eyes, and spoke to him in calm, measured tones about how blessed they were, how peaceful they felt, how grateful they were for Reverend Pritchard's guidance. Thomas watched them disappear into the cold December night, and he realized he was witnessing something more horrifying than simple oppression. He was witnessing the systematic destruction of a community's capacity to resist, to remember, to demand justice. And it was being done in the name of peace. Reverend Pritchard stood beside him on the church steps. "You'll report this to your superiors, of course." "Yes. And what will you tell them? That I've discovered a way to prevent racial violence? That freed slaves in my county live peacefully and productively? That we've achieved what Reconstruction has failed to achieve elsewhere?" Pritchard's smile was cold. "Or will you tell them about something in the basement that they'll never believe exists? That you yourself can barely believe you witnessed?" Thomas realized the terrible truth. He had no proof, no evidence except his own testimony, which would sound like madness. The creature left no marks, no physical evidence. The congregation would defend Pritchard if questioned, genuinely believing they'd simply found Christian peace. "You can't stop this," Pritchard said quietly. "And if you're honest with yourself, you're not certain you should. These people are safer without their anger. The white community is safer. Everyone is safer. All it costs is a little piece of their souls every Sunday." Thomas turned and walked away from St. Sebastian's church, his mind racing. He had witnessed something impossible, something evil masquerading as mercy. But Pritchard was right about one thing. Thomas wasn't certain he should stop it. Because the alternative was violence, suffering, the ugly reality of Reconstruction that was playing out in blood across the rest of the South. What he would do next, Thomas didn't know. But as he walked through the peaceful streets of Ashford, listening to the calm voices of freed slaves heading home with empty souls, he understood that sometimes the most horrifying evil is the kind that genuinely makes life easier. Sometimes the cage is so comfortable that the prisoners defend their captivity. And sometimes peace is just another word for surrender. Thomas didn't sleep that night. He sat in his boarding house room, staring at the wall, replaying what he'd witnessed in St. Sebastian's church. Every rational part of his mind insisted he'd experienced some kind of hallucination brought on by exhaustion or illness. But he could still feel the cold air from the basement, still smell that ancient organic scent, still see the darkness flowing across the floor with impossible purpose. At dawn, he dressed and walked through Ashford streets, observing the town with new eyes. Everything looked normal. People beginning their Monday routines, opening shops, heading to work in the fields. But Thomas now understood what lay beneath the surface calm. He stopped at the general store, where a white proprietor named Edmund Nash was arranging goods on shelves. Thomas introduced himself and engaged Nash in conversation about the town's history. "St. Sebastian's is quite an old church," Thomas observed. "When was it built?" 1834, Nash replied proudly. "My grandfather was one of the founding members. Built it over an old Creek Indian site. The natives considered it sacred ground, though they wouldn't say why exactly. Just kept warning the builders not to disturb what was below." "And did they disturb it?" Nash shrugged. "They dug the foundation, built the church. Whatever was there is still there, I suppose. Never caused any problems." He paused. "Well, except for the cold. Church has always been unnaturally cold, especially in the evenings. Some people say it's haunted, but that's just superstition. Have you attended the evening services? The ones for the colored congregation?" Nash's expression became carefully neutral. "No, that's not my place. We worship in the morning, they worship in the evening. Reverend Pritchard handles both. Says it's important they have their own space to find peace. And have they found peace? Absolutely. Before Pritchard started those evening services, we had problems: theft, arguments, former slaves acting uppity and refusing to show proper respect. Nothing violent, but tensions were building. Since the evening services started, all that's disappeared. They're calm, respectful, grateful for their situations. It's remarkable, really. Pritchard should be teaching his methods to ministers across the South. Thomas thanked Nash and continued his investigation. He spent the morning visiting other white residents, hearing variations of the same story. Before the evening services began 3 years ago, tensions had been high. After the services started, the black population became docile, peaceful, easy to manage. No one questioned why. No one found it suspicious that traumatized former slaves would so quickly find perfect contentment. They simply accepted the miracle and benefited from it. That afternoon, Thomas returned to Liberty Quarter. He needed to speak with someone from the black community away from the church, away from Reverend Pritchard's influence. He found Dinah Carlisle, the woman he'd spoken with on his first day, working in her small vegetable garden. "Mrs. Carlisle, may I speak with you?" Privately. Dinah looked around, noted that no one else was nearby, and nodded. "Come inside, Reverend." Her home was modest. 2 rooms, simple furniture, but clean and well-maintained. She offered Thomas water and sat across from him at a small wooden table. "I attended the evening service last night," Thomas began carefully. Dinah's hand stilled on her water cup. "And what did you see?" "I saw something impossible. Something that shouldn't exist." Thomas leaned forward. "Mrs. Carlisle, are you aware of what's happening in that church?" For a long moment, Dinah was silent. Then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "We know. You know? You understand that something is taking your anger, your grief, your right to feel what you've endured. We understand that every Sunday, we go to that church feeling like we're burning from the inside. And we come out feeling peace." Dinah's eyes met his. "You think we don't know it's wrong? You think we don't understand we're giving up something we should keep? But Reverend, you don't understand what it's like to carry that much rage. It was killing us. Before the evening services, we had 3 people die from what Dr. Henderson called Negro madness, just consumed by grief and anger until their hearts gave out. We had Isaiah Dunham hang himself because he couldn't stop remembering what was done to his daughter before she was sold south. We had Rebecca Toms try to burn down the mayor's house with his family inside because he'd owned her mother. She stood, pacing the small room. We were destroying ourselves. The anger was eating us alive, and there was nothing we could do about it. No justice, no punishment for the people who tortured us, no way to make it right. Just rage with nowhere to go except inward. So you choose to give it away?" Thomas said quietly. "To that thing in the basement. We choose to survive," Dinah corrected. "Is it wrong? Probably. Is it unnatural? Definitely. But it lets us live. It lets us raise our children without passing that poison on to them. It lets us work and build lives without constantly wanting to burn the world down." Thomas felt his moral certainty crumbling. "But you're not free. Not really. You're being controlled, manipulated. We were never free, Reverend." Dinah's voice was sharp. "Freedom is a word white people use to make themselves feel better about emancipation. We're not free. We're still working the same fields, still living in the same quarters, still subject to the same white men's whims. The only difference is they can't sell us anymore. But they can still hurt us, still deny us justice, still make our lives hell if we resist. The evening services don't take our freedom. We never had it. They just take the pain of pretending we do." Thomas stood, moved to the window. Outside, he could see black children playing in the dusty street, playing with the calm, quiet behavior of children who had been taught never to make too much noise, never to draw attention, never to upset the white community that surrounded them. "What if I told you I might be able to stop it?" he asked. "That I could find a way to destroy that thing, to give you back your capacity to feel everything. Anger, grief, righteous fury at what was done to you." Dinah's laugh was bitter. "And then what? We burn with rage again. We destroy ourselves, or get ourselves killed fighting battles we can't win. Reverend, you want to give us back our pain because you think we have some moral obligation to suffer authentically. But we're tired. We're so tired. And if the price of rest is a little piece of our souls every Sunday, most of us are willing to pay it." "Most of you," Thomas repeated. But not all. Dinah's expression changed. She moved closer, lowering her voice even though they were alone. There are some who refuse to attend the evening services, who'd rather burn than give up their anger. They live on the outskirts of Liberty Quarter, barely tolerated by the rest of us. We think they're foolish, choosing pain over peace. But, she paused, but sometimes I envy them, because they're still holy themselves, even if being themselves means suffering. Can you take me to them? Dinah hesitated, then nodded. Tonight, after dark. But Reverend, if you're planning to interfere, you need to understand something. Most of us don't want to be saved. We want to be left alone to survive the best way we can. Don't take that choice from us in the name of moral principle. That night, Dinah led Thomas to the far edge of Liberty Quarter, where 5 families lived in conditions notably worse than the rest of the Black community. Their cabins were more run down, their gardens less productive, their children thinner and more ragged. They're punished for their refusal, Dinah explained. Not officially, but in 100 small ways. Given worse jobs, paid less, excluded from community support. The white folks tolerate them because Reverend Pritchard asked them to. Says it's important to respect free will, that forced peace isn't real peace. But they make life hard enough that most people eventually give in and start attending services. She knocked on the door of the largest cabin. A man in his 40s answered, tall, heavily muscled, with eyes that burned with the anger that had been extracted from everyone else in Liberty Quarter. Dinah, he said, his voice wary. What brings you to this side of the quarter? This is Reverend Garrett. He's from the north, investigating conditions here. He wants to talk to people who don't attend evening services. The man studied Thomas for a long moment, then stepped aside. I'm Joshua Blackwood. Come in. Inside, Thomas found himself facing 6 adults and 3 children, all crowded into the cabin's single main room. They looked at him with suspicion and something else. Hope, perhaps, that someone from the outside might finally understand their situation. Tell me what you know about the creature, Thomas said without preamble. About what's in that church basement. Joshua exchanged glances with the others, then spoke. We know it's old. Older than the church, older than Ashford, older than slavery in this region. The Creek people who lived here before whites came knew about it. They called it the hollow voice, something that lived deep underground and fed on human emotion. The Creek learned to avoid it, built their villages far from its feeding grounds. But the whites who founded Ashford knew about it too, continued a woman named Sarah, whose face bore scars from old whippings. They built the church directly over it deliberately. At first, they used it themselves, had services where they'd feed it their own fears and doubts. But then they realized it could be used another way. It could be used on us. The evening services started during slavery, Joshua said. Secret gatherings where they'd forced the most rebellious slaves to attend, to have their resistance literally consumed. Made them docile, easy to control. After the war, Pritchard expanded it, made it voluntary, called it a path to peace and forgiveness. But the purpose is the same. Keep us manageable. Keep us from demanding justice or fighting back. Thomas sat down heavily. Why don't you attend? If it brings peace, if it makes life easier. Because that peace is a lie, Sarah said fiercely. Because our anger is righteous. Because what was done to us deserves rage and grief and fury. Because if we give away our pain, we give away our memories, our experiences, our right to witness what happened. Someone has to remember. Someone has to carry that weight, even if it's crushing us. It is crushing you, Thomas observed. I can see it. You're being destroyed by what you're carrying. Better destroyed by truth than preserved by lies, Joshua said. Reverend, everyone else in Liberty Quarter has given up pieces of themselves every Sunday for 3 years. They're not whole anymore. They can't remember clearly what was done to them. The creature eats memories along with emotions. They're becoming empty vessels, peaceful and hollow. We refuse. We'd rather suffer everything, feel everything, than lose ourselves to that thing. A young woman named Ruth spoke up, her voice trembling. My mother attends the evening services. She's been going for 2 years. Last month, I asked her about my sister who was sold away when I was 7. And my mother couldn't remember her name, couldn't remember her face. The grief of losing her daughter had been fed to that creature so many times that the memory of having a daughter went with it. That's what happens. You don't just lose the pain. You lose the person you were, the experiences that shaped you, the love you felt for people who were taken from you. Thomas felt sick. Does Pritchard know this is happening? He knows, Joshua said flatly. He considers it a feature, not a problem. People who can't remember their trauma don't demand justice for it. They become perfect workers, calm, accepting, grateful for scraps. It's the ultimate control, not just taking our labor like they did under slavery, but taking our very capacity to resist. I need to stop this, Thomas said. I need to find a way to destroy that creature, to free everyone who's been affected. No. Dinah's voice cut through the room. She had been standing silently in the corner, but now she stepped forward. Reverend, you need to understand what you're proposing. If you destroy that creature, everyone who's been feeding it will get everything back at once. 3 years of accumulated rage, grief, trauma, all flooding back in an instant. It will destroy them. Some will go mad. Some will become violent. Some will simply die from the shock. But they'll be themselves again, Thomas argued. They'll be whole. They'll be broken, Joshua interrupted. Dinah's right, even though I hate to admit it. We've talked about this, about what would happen if someone did destroy the creature. The people who've been attending services for years would be devastated. They can't handle getting all that pain back at once. It would be like, he struggled for words, like dam breaking. Everything they've been protected from would drown them. So what's the alternative? Thomas demanded. Let it continue. Let this creature keep feeding on people's souls until there's nothing left of them. The alternative, Sarah said quietly, is complicated. It's imperfect. It's probably morally indefensible. But it's what we have. Some of us refuse and carry everything. We're the memory keepers, the ones who remember what happened, who feel the full weight of it. The rest find peace through the creature, and they survive. Both groups are making choices about what they can live with. Thomas spent the rest of the night listening to their stories, their arguments, their desperate rationalizations. By dawn, he was no closer to knowing what to do. He had come to Ashford certain he would find oppression to expose and stop. Instead, he'd found something infinitely more complicated, a system of control that its victims had chosen, that brought them genuine relief from unbearable suffering, and that was destroying them so slowly they didn't notice it happening. Over the next week, Thomas conducted what he told people was a survey of religious practices, but what was actually an investigation into the creature's effects. He interviewed dozens of people who had been attending evening services for varying lengths of time, and the patterns were undeniable. Those who had attended for only a few months showed minimal effects. They were calmer, less angry, but still retained clear memories and strong personalities. Those who had attended for a year or more showed significant changes, gaps in memory, emotional flatness, difficulty forming new attachments, or caring deeply about anything. Those who had attended for the full 3 years since the services began were almost unrecognizable as the traumatized former slaves they had once been. They were peaceful, agreeable, utterly empty. Thomas documented everything in a detailed journal, including sketches of the creature based on what he'd witnessed, testimonies from both attendees and resistors, and his own analysis of the theological and moral implications. But documentation wasn't a solution. He still needed to decide what to do. On Thursday evening, 1 week after his arrival, Thomas requested a private meeting with Reverend Pritchard in the church. They sat in the front pews, late afternoon light slanting through the plain windows. "You've been investigating," Pritchard said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "And what have you concluded, Reverend Garrett?" Thomas chose his words carefully. "I've concluded that you've created a system of control more insidious than slavery ever was. Because at least slaves knew they were enslaved, knew they were being oppressed. Your congregation believes they're being saved." "They are being saved," Pritchard replied calmly. "From themselves. From rage that would destroy them and everyone around them. From grief so profound it makes life unbearable. From trauma that has no cure except time, and they don't have time. They need to survive now, to build lives now, to raise children now. The creature gives them that ability. At the cost of their souls. At the cost of their pain. There's a difference." Thomas stood, pacing. "I could expose this. I could write to my superiors, to newspapers, to anyone who would listen. I could bring investigators, scientists, people who could document what's in that basement, and who would believe them?" Pritchard asked. "Reverend Garrett, you witnessed the creature with your own eyes, and you've spent a week trying to convince yourself it was real. Do you really think Northern academics would accept testimony about an impossible creature living under a Georgia church? They'd declare everyone involved insane or lying. then I'll find another way. I'll organize the people who refuse to attend, help them resist, encourage others to join them. You'll get them killed." Pritchard's voice was sharp. "If the black population of Ashford becomes angry, resistant, demanding justice, the white population will respond with violence. There are still Klan sympathizers in this county, Reverend. The only reason there hasn't been racial violence here is because the black community is peaceful. Remove that peace, and you'll have a massacre within weeks." Thomas knew Pritchard was right. He'd seen it in other counties. Freed slaves who demanded their rights, who refused to be docile, who asserted their humanity. And he'd seen the violent white responses, the lynchings and massacres and night raids that left entire communities destroyed. "So what do you suggest?" Thomas asked bitterly. "That I simply accept this? That I walk away and let you continue feeding people's souls to that thing? I suggest you recognize that sometimes there are no good choices. Only terrible ones and slightly less terrible ones." Pritchard stood, moving to stand beside the door that led to the basement. "The creature will eventually consume everything if left unchecked. I'm not naive about that. In 10 or 15 years, everyone who attends regularly will be completely empty. But 10 or 15 years of peace, of relative safety, of being able to raise children without passing on trauma, that's worth something, isn't it? And after those 10 or 15 years, when you've created a population of empty shells, by then, perhaps Reconstruction will have actually worked. Perhaps racial equality will be real enough that black citizens won't need to carry rage just to survive. Perhaps their children, raised without that burning fury, will be able to integrate into society in ways their parents never could." Pritchard's smile was sad. "I'm not saying it's right, Reverend Garrett. I'm saying it's pragmatic. And in a world this broken, sometimes pragmatism is the best we can hope for." Thomas returned to his boarding house that evening with no answers, only more questions. He pulled out his journal and began writing his report to the church leadership in Philadelphia. But as he wrote, he found himself unable to recommend a clear course of action. On one hand, the creature was obviously evil, an abomination that fed on human suffering and left its victims diminished. It needed to be destroyed, the congregation freed, justice demanded. On the other hand, the congregation had chosen this. They weren't being forced to attend evening services. They came willingly, desperately grateful for the relief those services provided. Destroying their source of peace, flooding them with years of accumulated trauma, would be its own kind of cruelty. And overarching everything was the terrible practical reality. Any action that made Ashford's black population angry and resistant would likely result in white violence that would kill dozens, possibly hundreds of people. The peace the creature provided, artificial though it was saving lives. Thomas wrote late into the night, covering page after page with his observations, his analysis, his moral struggles. Finally, exhausted, he reached his conclusion. It was not the conclusion he wanted, not the clear moral victory he'd hoped for. But it was, he believed, the only responsible choice given the impossible circumstances. The next morning, Thomas requested one final meeting with Pritchard. They met in the church, alone. "I'm leaving tomorrow," Thomas said, "and I'm going to report that Ashford County has achieved a remarkable level of racial harmony through your innovative ministry techniques. I'll recommend your methods be studied and potentially implemented elsewhere." Pritchard's expression showed surprise, then understanding. "You're going to lie." "I'm going to protect people," Thomas corrected. "If I report the truth, or try to, one of two things will happen. Either I'll be believed and investigators will come who will destroy the creature and cause a catastrophe, or I won't be believed and I'll be dismissed as a madman. Neither outcome helps anyone. So you choose to do nothing." "I choose to do no harm," Thomas said firmly. "But I have conditions. First, you must limit evening services to once per month instead of weekly. Give people time between sessions so they don't lose themselves as quickly. Second, you must actively encourage some people to stop attending before they've lost too much. Rotate who participates so the burden is shared. Third, you must keep detailed records of everyone's condition so you can monitor the long-term effects." Pritchard considered this. "And in exchange?" "In exchange, I give you legitimacy. My report will bring positive attention to Ashford County. Other counties will want to learn from your example. You'll be protected from investigation because you'll be held up as a model of successful reconstruction." Thomas leaned forward. But if I hear that you violated these conditions, if I discover you're allowing the creature to consume people faster than necessary, I will come back. And I will find a way to destroy it and expose everything. Consequences be damned. You're choosing pragmatism over principle, Pritchard observed. I'm choosing the lesser evil over the greater one, Thomas replied. And I'll spend the rest of my life wondering if I made the right choice. They shook hands, two men who despised each other, bound together by shared knowledge of something too terrible to expose and too dangerous to ignore. Thomas spent his last day in Ashford saying goodbyes and conducting final interviews. He made a point of visiting Joshua Blackwood and the other resistors, explaining what he'd decided and why. You're abandoning us, Joshua said flatly. I'm keeping you alive, Thomas countered. If I destroy that creature, the backlash will kill you along with everyone else. This way, some people get peace, some people maintain their full humanity, and everyone survives. Some survival, Sarah muttered. Living alongside people who are being slowly erased. I know it's not enough, Thomas said. I know it's a compromise that feels like betrayal, but it's the best I can offer given what's possible. Ruth, the young woman whose mother couldn't remember her sister, spoke up. Will you remember us, Reverend? Will you carry the truth of what's happening here? Every day, Thomas promised. I'll document everything. And if circumstances change, if Reconstruction succeeds, if racial equality becomes real enough that you can safely resist without being massacred, I'll come back. I'll help you destroy that creature and reclaim yourselves. But until then, this is how it has to be. He left them in their rundown cabin on the edge of Liberty Quarter, knowing they saw him as just another white man making decisions about black lives for his own comfort. And perhaps they were right. That evening, Thomas attended his final service at St. Sebastian's, the Sunday evening service, his second and last time witnessing the creature's work. He watched as 60 people filed in, faces showing the week's accumulation of stress and pain. He saw children who had been insulted by white children that week, men who had been cheated on their wages, women who had been disrespected and demeaned. He saw the trauma of living as second-class citizens in a society that had recently viewed them as property. And then he watched as Reverend Pritchard opened the door, as the cold air flowed up from below, as the darkness touched each person and drew out their pain. He watched their faces relax, their bodies release tension, their eyes go from burning with fury to empty with peace. He watched them become less than they were, less human, less whole. And he did nothing, because sometimes doing nothing is the least harmful option available. Thomas left Ashford the next morning. His report to the church leadership praised Reverend Pritchard's innovative reconciliation methods and recommended Ashford County as a model for other communities struggling with Reconstruction. The report was published in the church newsletter and distributed widely. Reverend Pritchard received accolades. Ashford County received additional church funding and support. And every Sunday evening, the creature continued its work. In 1888, Thomas Garrett returned to Ashford County for the first time since his initial visit. He was 52 now, graying and worn by 2 decades of wrestling with the choice he'd made. He had never stopped documenting cases of racial injustice, never stopped fighting for equality through every legal and moral means available to him. But he had also never stopped carrying the weight of what he'd left undisturbed in that church basement. Ashford had changed. The town was larger, more prosperous. New buildings had been constructed around the central square. But St. Sebastian's Church remained exactly as Thomas remembered it, imposing fieldstone structure with a tall spire dominating the town. Thomas went first to Liberty Quarter. What he found shocked him. The cabins were empty. Not just unoccupied, emptied of people entirely. He found furniture, belongings, signs of recent habitation. But no people. The entire black population of Ashford appeared to have vanished. Heart-pounding, Thomas went to the boarding house, now run by Mrs. Henderson's daughter, and inquired about what happened to the black community. Oh, they're still here, the young woman said cheerfully. They just moved into town proper. Reverend Pritchard established a new neighborhood for them. Much nicer housing, closer to churches and schools. Said it was time for real integration. Thomas felt cold dread. And they agreed to this. The move. They insisted on it. Said they wanted to be closer to the church, wanted to attend services more frequently. Most of them go every night now, morning services for whites, evening services for coloreds, just like always. But some families attend both. Real integration happening, just like Reverend Pritchard always preached. Thomas found the new black neighborhood on the north side of town. The housing was indeed nicer, proper houses, not cabins. Well-maintained, comfortable. But when Thomas knocked on doors, the people who answered were strangers wearing familiar faces. They recognized him, greeted him by name, remembered his visit 20 years ago. But there was nothing behind their eyes. They spoke in calm, measured tones about how grateful they were for Reverend Pritchard's guidance, how peaceful their lives had become, how blessed they were. They had no anger, no grief, no strong feelings of any kind. They were perfectly content, perfectly obedient, perfectly empty. Thomas found his way to the edge of town, to where the resistors had lived. Those cabins were also empty, but in a different way, abandoned, not voluntarily evacuated. He found evidence of struggle, bloodstains long since faded to brown, and finally, a small marker in the woods. Here lie the resistors of Ashford Joshua Blackwood, Sarah Freeman, Ruth Williams, and 12 others who chose to remember 1871 to 1873 massacre. The resistors had been killed, quietly, their deaths covered up, their existence erased from town records. The marker was crude, hidden, maintained by someone who wanted them remembered even though speaking their names publicly was apparently forbidden. Thomas stood before that marker for a long time, tears streaming down his face. He had made a deal with the devil, thinking he was saving lives. But he'd only delayed the inevitable. The creature had continued feeding, growing stronger, consuming more. And when some people refused to submit, they had been eliminated. He had helped create this. His report had given Pritchard legitimacy, had protected him from investigation, had allowed this to continue for 20 years unchecked. That evening, Thomas went to St. Sebastian's church. He found Reverend Pritchard in his office, older now, but still commanding, still certain in his righteousness. "Reverend Garrett," Pritchard said without surprise, "I wondered when you'd return. What have you done?" Thomas demanded. "Everyone who attended services regularly is gone, consumed, emptied, turned into shells. And the ones who resisted were dealt with," Pritchard finished calmly. "You knew this would happen, Reverend Garrett. You knew the creature would continue consuming. You knew resistors would eventually become problems that needed solving. You chose to allow it anyway. I thought you would honor our agreement. Limit the services, rotate attendance, preserve as much of people's humanity as possible. I did honor it. For about 5 years." Pritchard shrugged. "But then the creature grew stronger, more demanding. It needed more frequent feeding. And honestly, the results were so positive, crime eliminated, perfect workers, no racial tensions, that limiting its work seemed counterproductive. Why preserve people's capacity for anger when that anger serves no purpose except to make them miserable?" Thomas felt rage building. The kind of rage he'd seen extracted from dozens of people that first Sunday evening he'd witnessed. "You're destroying an entire community." "I'm perfecting them," Pritchard corrected. "In another generation, the black population of Ashford will be completely integrated, completely peaceful, completely accepted by white society. Because they'll have been completely emptied of anything that makes white society uncomfortable. It's the ultimate solution to the race problem, Reverend Garrett. Remove their capacity to resist, and suddenly there's nothing to resist against. That's genocide. Slower than bullets, but just as complete. That's evolution. Society requires certain sacrifices. The strong survive by controlling the weak, and the weak survive by submitting to control. The creature simply makes that natural order more efficient." Thomas realized then that Pritchard had gone mad. Or perhaps he'd always been mad, and Thomas had been too desperate for pragmatic solutions to see it. Either way, the man before him was beyond reason, beyond redemption. "I'm going to stop this," Thomas said. "I'm going to expose everything. You're going to do exactly what you did 20 years ago," Pritchard interrupted. "Nothing. Because exposure would still cause more harm than good. Because admitting you were complicit would destroy your reputation and your ministry. Because you're too much of a coward to pay the price your principles demand." He was right. Thomas knew he was right. And that knowledge was more crushing than any physical blow. Thomas left Ashford that night, driving his rented buggy through darkness, haunted by the faces of people who no longer existed despite still breathing, by the marker for resistors he'd failed to protect, by the knowledge that his pragmatism had enabled 2 decades of slow destruction. He never returned to Ashford County again. 3 years before his death, Thomas Garrett completed a comprehensive journal documenting everything he'd witnessed in Ashford County. He sealed it with instructions that it not be opened until 1968, 100 years after his first visit, in hopes that by then, society might have evolved enough to handle the truth without violence. The journal's final entry reads, "I have spent my life fighting for justice, for equality, for the recognition of human dignity regardless of race. But in Ashford, I made a choice that betrayed every principle I claimed to hold. I chose pragmatic harm reduction over moral clarity. I chose survival over resistance. I chose to protect people from themselves rather than trusting them to choose their own paths, even if those paths led to suffering. I told myself I was preventing greater evil, that destroying the creature would cause catastrophic trauma, that exposing the truth would trigger racial violence, that maintaining the status quo was the lesser evil. But evil is evil, regardless of how we justify it. And I helped perpetuate a system of control that destroyed an entire community, not through violence, but through the slow theft of everything that made them human. The creature under St. Sebastian's Church is real. The systematic destruction of the black population's capacity to resist, to remember, to feel righteous anger at injustice, that is real. And it continues because I lacked the courage to stop it when I could have. I write this as testimony, as confession, and as warning. There will always be systems that promise peace through submission, that offer relief from suffering at the cost of one's essential humanity. There will always be people like Pritchard who believe control is mercy, that emptiness is peace, that survival justifies any compromise. And there will always be people like me. People who see evil clearly but choose pragmatism over principle, who tell themselves that doing nothing is better than risking greater harm. This is how evil persists, not through the actions of obvious monsters, but through the calculated inaction of people who convince themselves they're being reasonable. Whoever reads this, know that Ashford County still exists. The creature likely still feeds. The descendants of those first empty vessels likely still attend services, generation after generation, losing more of themselves. And know that I could have stopped it, but I didn't. That is my sin. That is my testimony. That is my warning. Sometimes the most dangerous evil is the kind that makes life easier. The journal was discovered in 1970, 2 years after the designated opening date. Investigators went to Ashford County, Georgia, to verify Thomas Garrett's claims. They found St. Sebastian's Church still standing, still holding services. They found a thriving, integrated community with no history of racial violence. They found black and white citizens living side by side in apparent harmony. And they found, when they interviewed people, that something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. Residents had no strong opinions about anything. They showed no anger about historical injustices. They couldn't recall family histories beyond a generation or two. They attended church services with unusual frequency, many going every single night, claiming it brought them peace. The investigators asked permission to examine the church basement. Reverend Harold Pritchard, grandson of William Pritchard, denied the request, citing structural concerns and insurance liability. When investigators threatened to obtain a court order, the entire town united in opposition. Black and white residents stood together, calmly and peacefully insisting that outsiders had no right to disturb their community, to interfere with their religious practices, to question their way of life. The investigation was quietly closed. The journal was sealed again, this time indefinitely, by people who decided some truths were too dangerous to reveal. And in the basement of St. Sebastian's Church, something ancient continued its work, feeding on generations of accumulated pain, rage, and grief, leaving behind calm, empty people who called their hollowness peace. The final question Thomas Garrett's journal poses has never been answered. Is it more cruel to let people suffer authentically, or to ease their suffering by stealing the very essence of who they are? Is peace at any price truly peace? Or is it just another word for surrender? And if people choose their own destruction because existence is unbearable without it, do we have the right to save them from themselves? Ashford County still exists. St. Sebastian's Church still stands. Services continue every evening, 7 nights a week. And if you visit, you'll find the most peaceful, integrated, harmonious community in all of Georgia. You'll also find that no one who lives there can tell you why. What do you think really happened under St. Sebastian's Church? Was Thomas Garrett right to choose pragmatism over principle? Could there be other communities where something similar is happening right now? hidden beneath the surface of inexplicable peace? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story made you question what you do in an impossible situation, subscribe to Untold Fear and share this video with someone who appreciates horror that asks difficult questions. Some monsters wear human faces, and sometimes the real horror is realizing we might become those monsters in the name of doing good.